Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our Chifley Conversation with Chris Bowen. It's the first in our new series of Chifley Conversations. I'm David Epstein and I'm Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. Our office is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and Chris is joining us from the land of the Darug people, and I'm speaking to you from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation down in Victoria. We'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands and the lands from all the places where you're joining us from, and to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We'll be speaking with Chris tonight about his new book, Labor People, and we've got 3 more conversations lined up in the incoming weeks. Next week, we'll have Dr. John Edwards and George Megalogenis talking to us about post-pandemic economic policy and government priorities. And that's recapping John Edwards' Low Institute paper and George's recent quarterly essay. The week following that, we've got Gideon Haigh with his new book, The Brilliant Boy, on Doc Evatt and the Great Australian Descent. And then we'll be following that with Enough is Enough, where Jenny Macklin and Kate Thwaites will be talking about their book and the issues it deals with as far as the challenges that women face in federal politics. Each of these conversations is scheduled for about 45 to 50 minutes with opportunities for questions from you, and we'll make recordings and excerpts available later. You can submit your questions via the chat function, and we'll get to the others who raise their virtual hands if there is time. I'm going to be talking to Chris tonight about his book for around about 30 minutes, and then we'll go into the Q&A session. So I hope you enjoy this Chifley conversation. Chris is, of course, well known to most of us. Elected to Parliament in 2004, he's held a wide range of portfolios, serving as Treasurer, Minister for Human Resources, Minister for Immigration, Minister for Financial Services, Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Competition Policy, Minister for Small Business, and Minister for Tertiary Education. So he's packed a lot in. As you might imagine if you know Chris's work ethic. He entered Parliament with a Bachelor of Economics and a Master's in International Relations, but since then he's managed to teach himself Bahasa Indonesian and gain a diploma in modern languages. That's all, of course, on top of sharing the work of raising a young family and caring, I believe, for the odd Labrador or two, which can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. Chris was interim leader of the Labor Party and acting leader of the opposition following the leadership changes of the last federal election, and also served as Shadow Treasurer. He's now Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy. So he's been responsible for wide reform programs in portfolios he's held. But he's also made time to write 4 books and contribute to several others. And we're here to talk about the latest one, Labor People, which tells the story of 6 unsung, largely overlooked true believers who contributed mightily to the ALP and to the wider Australian community. So Chris Bowen, a lengthy introduction, but I needed to be because you've packed in a lot. Welcome to the Chifley Conversation.
Thanks very much, David,
for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to a good Chris, conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start, first of all, with why you wrote this book. In fact, it's the second book that you've cranked out this year. You started the year with a book on the unworthy, and now you've got a book on the worthy. What brought you to this, and why did you select the people you did?
Well, that's true, David. That's a good way of putting it. But look, this book has been floating around in my head for many years. It's always a book that I thought I might like to write if I ever got the opportunity. And really, it was driven by the fact that for those of us who love Labor Party history, which is probably everybody on this in this conversation, there are bookshelves full of books on the leaders, on the prime ministers, on the big personalities, on the big moments in our history. But our party is so much more than that, of course. I always like to think of it in the way that Graham Freudenberg said that the Labor Party is a collective memory in action, but it's a collective memory of not just the Curtins and the Chifleys and the Whitlams and the Hawks and the Keatings, but it's a collective memory of all of us in action. And so I knew that there'd be obviously thousands of people with fascinating stories to tell who've contributed to our movement, and thought I should just pick some of those stories as perhaps emblematic of the broader stories, and then sort of just set about thinking about who they might be. And really, I'd say there were three whom I knew about when I was picking them: Frank Tudor, John Dedman, and Ken Reid, who I had heard of but didn't really know I felt enough about. And then three who I just sort of came across, in various footnotes and things like that, and thought, oh, I've never really heard of those people. Gregor McGregor, Lillian Locke, and Gertrude Melville, and they had fascinating stories to tell. And I could have written, I could have kept going. I could have picked many more people, but you have to draw the line somewhere. So they're the six I chose.
Rightio. So you essentially just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down your list, or did you do a bit of winnowing beforehand?
No, I did do it. I did do it chronologically as it happens. That's not always how you do it, but in this case, I did do it chronologically, starting with Gregor McGregor, our first deputy leader. And, that is probably the trivia question which floors all, even aficionados of Labor Party history. Who was the first deputy leader of the Labor Party? I asked many people who get, almost any trivia question correct, and that floored most. The only person whom it didn't floor was John Faulkner, who knew the answer, but basically everybody else said, oh, first deputy leader, I got no idea. And then, as I said, just sort of work through sort of roughly decade by decade. Who's somebody who I think is really interesting and probably played a big role in our party's history in that decade, but really hasn't been celebrated enough, may have fallen off the public consciousness. Ken Reid probably, because he's the most recent, is probably still a bit more in the public consciousness. But even then, when I really delved into his history, there was so much that people don't know about him and his role in the Whitlam government. And it was a really fascinating story to tell. So from McGregor to Reid, they really are, key factors, key figures. And as it happens, both of them were the first and the last in the series of characters I looked at were Labor leaders in the Senate. McGregor was deputy leader in the Senate by virtue, deputy leader of the Labor Party by virtue of being leader in the Senate. That's the way the caucus was set up at that point, that the deputy leader was whoever was leader in the Senate, and the leader of the party was whoever was leader in the House. That changed after McGregor, because it was basically because of him and his personality that they did that. Just basically thought, I'm sure there's stories to be told here, wonderful stories, and they all stood up. There was a degree of arbitrariness about who I would pick, but I'd like to think, and I would argue, that the stories, not because of the way I've written them, but their stories are just so compelling that they all sort of worked as major parts of the book.
So, I mean, we've clearly got the thread of the story, uncovering the stories of those who are perhaps less well known these days. And you were just talking about McGregor and how he became deputy leader. And then at the end of the book, of course, you spend some time on Reid and his regrets about particularly his relationship with Gough Whitlam, where there's this thread coming through that, perhaps the leadership in the Senate is not being given the regard that it might have, and that might have helped at the time. So you've got a bit of a bookend there. What other threads are running through the book apart from?
That's a good one, and you're right. And we can talk more about Reid, but of course, Reid is, to the degree Reid is remembered, as often for a conversation he didn't have, because Gough forgot to tell him they'd been dismissed. And history may or may not have been different if Gough had told his Senate leader that they'd been dismissed. We can talk about that perhaps in a little more detail. But in terms of the threads, I guess there's a few. I mean, overall loyalty to the party, it was just extraordinary, and basically disloyalty to the party was a disqualification to be written about in this book. You have to be loyal to the party. I had a couple of criteria, one of which was, you'd been loyal to the party and made a huge contribution. 2, you're misunderstood or forgotten, no full-length biography written about you. One exception to that was John Dedman. There has been a biography written about John Dedman, but it's very hard to find. It's very inaccessible. It's a good book, but it's, not many people have their hands on it. So I figured I'd give him an exemption. But the loyalty to the party of these people was just extraordinary. Lillian Locke, who was our suffragist, she was the person in the Labor Party who I think made the biggest contribution to female suffrage, to female votes. There were many, of course. The Golding sisters in New South Wales are deserving of great credit, and others. But Lillian Locke was the first full-time female employee of the Labor Party. She was an organiser in the Victorian, what we would now call the Victorian branch of the Labor Party, the political league, and the first female delegate to an ALP federal conference, as they were called in those days, national conferences now. But she was so loyal to the party. She was a passionate suffragist, passionate advocate for female votes. But in 1903, when Vida Goldstein, who was a very good friend of Lillian Locke's, they were, very close. And in fact, Lillian followed Vida Goldstein into Christian Science, for example. That's how much influence she had on her. When she ran for the Senate as an independent, the Labor Party said, no, sorry, you can't be a member of the Women's Suffrage League and a member of the Labor Party if the Women's Suffrage League is supporting an independent candidate. And Lillian Locke said, oh, okay, fine. Well, then I'll resign from the Women's Suffrage League. Despite the fact she'd been the secretary and a leader of it, her loyalty to the Labor Party was massive. Through to Gertrude Melville, who was the first woman elected to the upper house in New South Wales, the Legislative Council in New South Wales. There had been women appointed under the old system, and she was the first woman elected to the upper house. And she was actually the first woman pre-selected by the New South Wales Labor Party for a lower house seat, which she lost. But she joined the party very early. She was loyal through, many splits, starting with conscription, but right through the Lang split in New South Wales. And it was actually, for somebody interested in state politics, it was a big call to stick with Chifley and to oppose Lang, which she did. And then right through the terrible splits of the 50s. And if you read the Gertrude Melville chapter, I found it fascinating. I found in the State Library of New South Wales a file which I don't think had been opened for 40 years at least, which was the minutes of the Women's Conference of 55, which Gertrude Melville was the chair, and it was absolutely robust and full on and big fight. And she was loyal to Everett and to the federal party. But I guess another theme, Epi, is that religion plays such a role in these characters all the way through. We often think of the Labor Party as a Catholic party in the early years, but that was really only true after the conscription split. McGregor was a pillar of the Church of Scotland. He was a teetotaler. He believed in the separation of church and state, though. I write in the book that he argued that there should be no prayers in Parliament because he believed in the separation. He was a very devout pillar of the Church of Scotland. John Dedman was an elder of the Presbyterian Church. Frank Tudor, who was our leader when Billy Hughes walked out on the party, was a Congregationalist elder. Gertrude Melville was a very good Catholic. And Ken Reet was not a Buddhist in the strict sense of the word, but he was very, very interested and dedicated to the principles of Buddhism and spent many years studying them. So he was a very spiritual man as well. And some of his colleagues, when I interviewed them, said, he was a Buddhist, which he actually technically wasn't, but he was a very spiritually interested person. So spiritualism and religion was very important for all of the characters in the book, which not many people might not be the thing that most people think of when they think of the history of the Labor Party as well.
Do you think that's a bit of an unconscious attraction for yourself in these things? Because you've previously spoken publicly about the need for political progressives and particularly people in the Labor Party to be more mindful and more understanding of faith-based perspectives. And you have mentioned the fact that Ken Reet was perhaps a bit of an outlier, but very spiritual, and McGregor, as you've said, was someone who clearly had a lot of very strong religious belief and participation, but believed quite firmly in one, not being overt about it, and two, keeping it out of the formality of politics. But how do you think their religious faith would sit in a modern political world?
So
and can we draw anything from it?
Yeah, it really is a coincidence, David, the fact that, I've expressed views about the relationship between the Labor Party and faith communities, and the fact that these people were people of faith. That in most instances, I didn't realise it until after I picked them. You pick them and then you start researching them, and then you find the church records and what have you. So that's very much a coincidence as it happens. But I do think it's a reminder that our party, has sprung from, many of our earliest activists, the trade unionists who formed the Labor Party were deeply religious people. Again, mainly the Protestant churches, mainly Methodist and Church of Scotland, what we now call Presbyterian, or what's now the Uniting Church, but also some Church of England activists as well. And their humanism, their concern for their fellow humans it was at least informed in part by their faith. And I think drawing on that heritage and reminding people of faith that, there's much that unites progressives, as we all are, and people who care about the human condition and the quality of life of our fellow human beings, and faith. And this is not in any way an argument that we should reduce our ambition or our views about, freedom of choice in social matters, etc. But it's a matter of just remembering that there is a lot of crossover potentially, including my current portfolio of climate change, where faith groups have very strong views by and large about caring for the planet, and that's pretty much aligned with where we're coming from as people who care about the future of the planet. So there is lots of I think just potential, without overstating it, to remind ourselves that many in the Labor Party have come from a spiritual or faith-based background in our history, and been great contributors to our party's progress over the years.
Yeah. Returning to another aspect that you were talking about earlier, which is, I suppose, it's a different dimension of how people come to the Labor Party. You were talking about loyalty, and then you used the illustrations of Lillian Locke and Gertrude Melville, two women who were very significant labourist activists, very active in the labour movement, but in some senses should be equally recognised for their as political actors, for their distinct contribution to female suffrage and feminism more generally. To some degree, I suppose you could also talk about John Dedman, who spent some time in another political party, but he also came to the Labor Party not so much out of a basic belief in Labor, but about a basic belief about some core issues. But Locke and Melville in particular, in a modern world, they might be regarded as initially single issue or specialist advocates, in the same sense that Vida Goldstein might have. Vida chose a different path. These two women, you value them for their loyalty, and they chose the Labor Party. What does it sort of say about, for the people coming from those sorts of causes? Is it better to be in or out of the tent, as it were? Do you think, having had, if you compare those two women perhaps to Vida Goldstein?
Yeah, obviously I think it's better to be in the tent. I think that's the whole sort of my approach to politics and my approach to this history. But I actually wrote about it explicitly in the Lillian Locke chapter. I just picked up the book to find the page. But interestingly, I mean, that's where Vida Goldstein and Lillian Locke sort of had a disagreement. I think they must have fallen out, although Vida Goldstein then come to Lillian Locke's wedding, which was to a Labor MP, so they must have patched it up again. But at the time, Lillian Locke said, and she wrote this, had Vida Goldstein attached herself to a party, she might now be in federal parliament. So she was sort of saying that Vida Goldstein had gone the wrong road, whereas Vida Goldstein had the view that the Labor Party wasn't going to put a woman in parliament for a long time. I think they were both right, because Vida Goldstein didn't end up in parliament. She ran continually, and it wasn't until 1943. I mean, we're talking about Vida Goldstein running for the Senate in 1903 for the first time. The Labor Party didn't put a woman in it until 1943. And then we didn't put another woman into parliament until Joan Child in 1974. So we were very slow. And we put, Gertrude Melville into the upper house in New South Wales in 1952. Sorry, 1955. So, they both had something going for their points of view. But ultimately, I think, although we were slow, ultimately the Labor Party's put more people into Parliament, more females into Parliament than any other political party. And now the disparity between us and the Conservatives is enormous. And while there's a couple of female independents, the road is hard for independents. So ultimately, I think Lillian was right and Vida Goldstein was wrong. But, nevertheless, they both had something in their argument.
Fair enough. Well, look, we might, at that point, stay with Lillian, but divert from politics a bit. This was a connection I was not aware of, and that's, of course, the connection between Lillian Locke and Sumner Locke Elliott. She's clearly had an influence going on what you've written on the writing of Sumner Locke Elliott, who was indeed her nephew, and therefore on Australian literature. Can you tell us some more about that? Because I think people might be a little bit surprised to learn all this.
Yeah, totally. I think many people are. And when I started looking at Lillian Locke, I found these references to her. She's largely been forgotten even in Labor Party history. I mean, I think there's one reference to her in The Light on the Hill, Ross McMullen's book from the 1990s. And there's little footnotes here and there, but she's not a central figure in the written history of the party. And she's referred to in the histories of suffrage in Australia. But I looked into that in a lot more detail and figured, I worked out from my point of view, she's a much bigger figure than history has recorded her as in the history of suffrage and Labor's role in suffrage in Australia. But then when I started looking at her name, I found she popped up occasionally in literary history as well. But nobody had really made the link that it was the same person. And I could not find anybody in any of the writings who had made the reference, apart from, the most passing of tangential reference to the fact that Lillian Locke, the Labor suffragist, was Lillian Locke, the key character in Sumner Locke Elliott's novels. And she's clearly the one and the same person. So after her active involvement in politics, she was still her husband went in and out of federal parliament a couple of times and they moved around a bit, but she was still very active in parliament. But her sister was a playwright and a novelist. And she died in childbirth, giving birth to Sumner Locke Elliott. And Lillian and her husband, George, took custody of the baby the day after the birth and the tragic death of the mother. But there was no sort of custody arrangements. There was no will, so it all became very messy. And Lillian devoted herself to young Sumner, but another sister who was based in London and who considered herself socially superior, arranged basically to attack the custody and came back to Australia and said that, we can't have this terrible socialist family looking after young Sumner. And it ended up in a very horrible court case between the two sisters. And I actually went into the Supreme Court in New South Wales and got my hands on the original notes and the judge's notes. It's all still there, the actual sort of calligraphy writing of the judge. It's all the originals are still there. It was fascinating. And the judge actually took young Sumner away to the Blue Mountains for a weekend, which is just unthinkable now. You would end up in a lot of trouble if you tried that now. And the court case was eventually settled, but Sumner Locke Elliott absolutely was devoted to Lillian Locke, the woman who brought him up, and did not want to go with the other sister Jess, and did not want to go to the fancy school Cranbrook where she enrolled him, and resented it for the rest of his life, and wrote one of his first novels about it. And that novel was Careful He Might Hear You, where his aunt Lil is clearly Lillian, and the characters are very thinly disguised as the characters from his childhood. And of course, Careful He Might Hear You was one of the very earliest winners of the Miles Franklin Award, and went on in the 1980s to be turned into a blockbuster Australian movie. And Patrick White, just in an amazing turn of phrase, modestly said, Sumner Locke Elliott is the finest Australian novelist alive apart from me. So he was a very serious character in Australian literary history. But what a lot of people who know of Careful He Might Hear You would not realise just what an important book it is in Labor Party history.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it sounds like the Locke family were a fascinating and quite diverse family. Have you been motivated to explore them any more since writing the book? Or
yeah, and again, you find little references to them in various literary histories, but both of Lillian Locke's grandfathers were Church of England ministers, both of them. So it was, again, very her social activism was very driven by her religion. But the sisters, there were many sisters, and they were all passionate about what they did. So there was the novelist, the playwright. There was also a sister who became. They all entered Christian Science, the Church's Christian Science, but one became a pastor. And then there was Aunt B, who was from everything I can gather, relatively famous or prominent Australian actress in the time. And so they all had these, they were all very, very different, but, all just completely devoted themselves to their particular causes. But Lillian died in very sad circumstances. Her husband, George, died several years before her. And then she was in the care of the sister who was a pastor in the Church of Christian Science, and the actress. And they forbade medical treatment of her because it was against the teachings of the church. And she died without medical treatment. And, who knows whether she would have lived with it, but she wasn't given that chance. Although the sisters, when they were sick years later, gave themselves medical treatment. So I found that a bit sad and confronting that poor Lillian was the victim of her family, to at least to some degree in her final years in that sense. But an amazing family.
We're just about to reach the time where we have a bit of Q&A, Chris, but I can't sort of let you go without asking about your own writing practice, seeing that we've been on the cause of literature for a couple of minutes. I can see rows of books behind you, and you've done a lot of things in politics, and you continue to do a lot of things in politics, and yet you've managed to crank out these 4 books. How do you do it, and what's your writing practice, and what motivates you? Because it happens a bit in Australian politics, but nowhere near as much as you might see, for example, in the UK. So I'm just interested in this, and interested in the fact that that you might be a bit unique in an Australian circumstance anyway.
So, yeah, it is very much a UK tradition that serving members of parliament are a lot more prolific authors than it's been the Australian tradition. That's going way back, and it's still the case now. The current Shadow Home Secretary is a very well-respected historian and author, for example. From my point of view, every practitioner of politics is different, but from my point of view, I find it very useful to step back and to take a broader view. We can all do, and I do, the day-to-day, make sure I do my best to get on the 6 o'clock news and tweet away and, come up with the lines of the day and engage in what's our next policy announcement and what's, are we on track to win an election and what more do we need to do and all that. That's the core part of the job, and will always be the core part of the job. But I also think it's useful for me and important for politicians to do whatever it works for the individual, to step back and think about the bigger picture. And why are we doing this and where are we going? And sometimes for me, that's writing about the future. As you said, on Charlatans, a book I wrote was really about the future, or the present and the future. Or sometimes it's writing about the past and learning from the past. So Money Men, the book I wrote about the history of the treasurers of Australia, I found when I was shadow treasurer and treasurer, enormously helpful for my day job to bear in mind what the people who held that job in the past had been through. And I think likewise, this book plays a role. So, for example, we're in the current, you've got an upcoming webinar about, post-pandemic economics. Well, John Dedman was thinking and writing about post-war economics. He was Chifley's right-hand man when it came to post-war reconstruction. John Dedman was the father of the Australian National University and the modern CSIRO and modern education system. And this was all in the war planning, the Curtin Chifley post-war planning. And really, Dedman was the nuts and bolts man to make it all work and happen. So,
yeah,
for me, there's lessons from John Dedman in the current environment. For example, he was Minister for Wartime Production for the first part of the war industry for the first part of the war. He was very unpopular with some of the things he had to do, which sort of has some lessons at the moment, because he had to bring in all sorts of restrictions and conditions and civil liberties restraints during the war, and that made him unpopular. And then he said, "But this is all going to be worth it because we're going to build post-war Jerusalem. We're going to build the peace, and we're going to build a much better Australia." And as I said, he was really we correctly talk about Chifley's post-war reconstruction, but when it needed to be done, he turned to Dedman for the details to get on with it while he was being Prime Minister.
Yeah, a much undervalued contribution. I had a childhood in Geelong, and every time you'd walk out of the railway station, you'd walk past the Gordon Technical College, and there was a building that had been erected that educated a lot of people on the initiative of John Dedman. And then I subsequently went to the ANU and spent probably too many hours in the John Dedman building, unfortunately now demolished. But yeah, I mean, they're tremendous achievements. We'll just turn now to questions, and people are welcome to raise their hands, but we've got a few on the list already. Adrian Boothman's got the very obvious question I think all of us would have. Will there be a part 2 or a volume 2 of Labor People? Will there be a series?
Well, there could easily be. I have no particular plans just at the moment, but as I said, when I was researching these characters, I'd find others who they interacted with and think, oh, I don't know much about them. And then before I knew it, I was starting to go down a rabbit hole of these other characters. There are other female activists who Gertrude Melville interacted with, for example, who I'd never heard of and had been forgotten. And I started to think, oh, they're really interesting. But then I think, oh, no, I can't do it. I've got to concentrate on the chapter at hand, and I can't just keep adding chapters because publishers don't like books on politics these days that are too long. Like I say, you've got to keep them, manageably short. So this one comes in, at a manageable size. But, I'll take a bit of a break now. We're going to have an election sooner rather than later, so that'll keep me busy. But I couldn't rule out, yes, when the time comes, maybe Labor people too. There's plenty of people who I could have written about in this book, but had to sort of put aside and could come back to at some point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, asking you about the ongoing, and she wonders whether there's a bit of an explanation in there or a bit of a relationship between the modern phenomenon of fake news and how far a party should bend its policies to the framing of its political vision on how they want to live their lives to be or perceive their lives to be, rather than present what the party believes is the reality. So in other words, I think what Janine's asking is, to some degree, do people fall back on a faith to provide a bit of comfort for views that might not necessarily be shared by the wider community or might be challenged in a robust debate on facts?
Well, if I understand the point Janine's making correctly, I think a political party's always got to base their views on facts and agreed facts and science and evidence. As that great US Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, sir, but not your own facts." And we just always have to bring it back to the facts of the matter. But I think it also does pay political parties to have consideration of what is motivating people who aren't fundamentally dishonest but have a different worldview to us, and can't see things and don't accept our explanation of the facts, whether it's climate change and climate science or pandemic science and vaccine science. I mean, this is huge at the moment. I'm dealing with both. I'm dealing with climate science in my portfolio and vaccine science and epidemic science in my MP's role, representing the epicenter of the pandemic at the moment in southwest Sydney, I'm spending a lot of time batting away misinformation and misapprehensions about the facts, which we just have to keep doing. But it also pays you to understand what is driving this. I mean, why are people so lacking in faith in political institutions? Why I spend a lot of time looking at One Nation, which is not great for my mental health, but I spend a lot of time looking at, what they're doing, what their tactics are. And, they are, I can't stand One Nation, but I do find them very politically astute and cunning. They see an opening, they're very anti-vax at the moment, very anti-lockdown, and they make these outrageous statements, and it gets traction in the community. I think they're getting a bit of traction on the anti-vax, anti-lockdown message. That doesn't change. Yeah. That doesn't change, why we should be obviously dedicated to the science of lockdowns and vaccination. But I think it pays for us to understand what is driving people's concerns about this. Why is One Nation doing this? They're not doing it for fun, and they're smart. Well, they're politically cunning, I should say, not smart. But they're doing it for a reason. They're onto something, and there's this deep well of concern in the community, and we have to be alive to that.
So are they leading or are they following? I mean, I was supposed to sort of drag it back to the question about faith. Are they people who might have started with faith but have perhaps walked away from their concern of whatever they had faith in and are now just more concerned with destruction and frustration?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although they're sort of, they're not leading, but they're egging it on. They're making it worse. So they see an opening in the community, and again, I wrote a little bit about this in On Charlatans. It's not just about One Nation; it's all the right-wing populists. But they see an opening of concern, whether it's about, in this case, science and vaccinations, or in other cases it's climate change, and other cases it's economic policy. So they detect the concern in the community, and then they just go down that opening and they egg it on and on and on and on, and get more people sort of talking about it. And radicalise many people in that sense, to be anti-politics and anti-establishment politics. And so, Labor and Liberal don't care about you because they're locking you in your house. Now, the majority of people don't like lockdowns. Who does? But get the science, get the need for it, prepared to make the sacrifice. But there are people out there who are looking for a voice, and these charlatans, One Nation, and Palmer and Craig Kelly are seeking to give them a voice.
Yeah. To turn it around a bit, Nicholas Bevan's asking, what do you think are points of improvement that you can see or learn from looking into the past of Labor, and how might you apply them now and beyond?
That's a good question, Nicholas. I guess all the people, all the subjects of the book really brought Labor back to the concerns of everyday Australians, which is really what we were talking about in another sense in the previous answer. I mean, they were all passionate progressives. They all wouldn't have used that term. Progressives wasn't a real term that they used in the early days of the party in particular, or even up to the 70s that I'm writing about with Ken Reid, but they all were in our understanding. But they all brought it back to the fundamental aspirations of the Australian people. Lillian Locke, was an amazing orator. She, her stump speech talking to women about their concerns and how giving women the vote or improving their representation of women would be good for them and their concerns. She was bringing it back to them. McGregor was, a very strong advocate of labour protections, and he could speak with a great deal of authenticity, because one thing we didn't touch on when we're talking about McGregor, but he was, by the time he became deputy leader of the Labor Party and the second most powerful member of the first few Labor governments, they didn't have the term deputy prime minister then, but in effect he was completely blind. He had lost his sight in a gardening accident. He was a gardening labourer. When Jordan Steelejohn, Senator Steelejohn, the little Green senator, was elected a few years ago, he said, "I'm the first Australian parliamentarian to be disabled." And I thought, well, that really ignores Graham Edwards, and who lost his legs in Vietnam, and all those people who had disabilities in World War II, but was also ignoring one of the first senators who was completely and totally blind. But he brought his lone lived experience back to the need to improve work health and safety and labouring conditions, and all the way through. I mean, Ken Reid was a merchant seaman. He spent years at sea. It's one of the reasons he was such a considered, thoughtful, and complicated thinker, because he had many years at sea with nothing to do but read books and read magazines, and he became a very erudite, considered man. But he always brought it back to the workers, because he'd been, he was a merchant seaman, but it was hard work. So he was very much in touch with the aspirations, what we would now call the aspirations of working people. So I guess that's what we can draw on.
Right. I've got a question here from a person who you might recognise, Louise from Melbourne. She's in fact your publisher. And Louise Adler would like to know if you can talk a little bit about writing biography, drawing on the experience of both the money men and now Labor people. They're both biographical projects, as Louise says. Do you have to like your subjects? And this is you personally. Obviously, some people, I'm thinking of Martin Wolf, for example, who's just written the latest Trump book. I don't think he likes his subject, but what about yourself?
I don't think you do have to like your subjects. No, you've got to respect your subjects, I think. As it happens, I like all six, fell in love with them, in some sense, because they were all such compelling characters. So in that sense, as it happens, I like them. But I think you've got to have fundamentally, if you're going to be a fair biographer, you've got to have respect for what the person was doing. I mean, probably, obviously there are some exceptions to that. Obviously, Alan Bullock, who was one of the world's great biographers, was writing about Hitler and Stalin. He wasn't big fans of them, but you've got to understand what motivates the people. And it was similar with the money men. I'd been a treasurer, and so I had fundamentally had a respect for anybody trying to do what is a very difficult job, where they're coming from, and started with a position of sympathy for them and the challenges, and tried to sort of cut them some slack there. And there was only really one treasurer in the money men I was deeply critical of, but the rest I was pretty understanding of. And the 12 treasurers I wrote about in the money men, I chose them because they were the most impactful treasurers in some way or another. Had the biggest impact on the job, on the portfolio. So in that sense, I respected them, and I think liked them as well. So as it happens, that's the way I tend to end up. But I don't think it's a precondition, essentially.
Right. Okay. So it appears from what you're saying, it's their motivation that draws you to them, which is a nice segue, because you've had your publisher ask a question. I've now got my chair asking a question, so I have to put this. Linda White is asking, has writing this book actually enabled you to understand the modern Labor Party more?
I think so. And that's partly why I write it. Why I write, because I think understanding history better helps you understand the present better, and understanding the history of the Labor Party helps you understand our current party. And obviously I love Labor history. I've read deeply about it, but when you really want to, as Winston Churchill said, if you really want to understand something, write a book about it. So you have to delve into it in a lot more detail. And there are things that, in the normal circumstances I'll read a book, I might think, oh, that's interesting. But, when you're writing about it, you have to be really across the detail and sure of your facts. So you really sort of look into things a lot more substance. So, yeah, I'd like to think that I do understand the Labor Party better having written it. And I would hope that people who read it understand the modern Labor Party, at least to a small degree, are better when understanding these elements of our history a little better. The story of Gregor McGregor and his role in the first Labor governments, I do think helps us understand the modern Labor Party. They had big debates in the early years about whether to go into coalition with other parties. That's now settled in the Labor Party. We don't do it. We govern alone or not at all. But it wasn't settled in the early years. And the debates they were having about what sort of party we'd be. Would we be a party which sort of can be maybe making a small difference at the edges of a government that we didn't entirely agree with, but we're improving it by being a member of it, or would we just wait and wait and wait until we could form a government ourselves? Well, they decided in the end to wait and wait and wait to be a government ourselves. And that's a pretty essential part of who we are now, and I think the right decision. But it helps to understand those early debates, to understand why we do tackle things the way we do now, I think.
Okay, well, look, Chris, we're sort of at time, as it were. Thank you very much for giving us some of your valuable time on a parliamentary sitting day. I think everyone's enjoyed it, and you've talked about where you learn things, and I think we've all learned things. Certainly recommend the book to anyone who wants to read it. If you don't have a copy of the book, you should absolutely seek it out, and offer people a discount if they go to Monash University Publishing. And if you use the discount code on the way out, Labor People 20 in capital letters, you'll get a 20% discount from Monash University Publishing. I hope everyone's enjoyed tonight's conversation. I'd like to thank all of those who assisted in putting it together, particularly Daisy Jeffrey, our new organiser at the Research Centre. As I said at the start, we will be posting recordings and publishing excerpts and please join us for further Chifley Conversations in coming weeks. We'll be shifting to Wednesday nights as of next week, when we speak to John Edwards and George Megalogenis on the 1st of September about economic policy and government priorities post the pandemic. And then, of course, we'll be following that the week after with Gideon Haig, and then after that, Jenny Macklin and Kate Thwaite. So once more, Chris, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and good night.
Thank you. Enjoyed it a lot.